Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. The pressure is immediate, the structure is exposed. The historical puzzle is not just who prevailed, but why did rulers deliberately give their most distant commanders more independent power, even knowing that power could one day be turned against them? At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because frontier stability may depend less on the personal loyalty of one commander than on a deliberately structured bargain that trades measurable central control. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate, the structure is exposed. Why did rulers deliberately give their most distant commanders more independent power, even knowing that power could one day be turned against them? The pressure is immediate, the structure is exposed. The problem begins when border threats move faster than central permission, yet the autonomy needed for quick response can slowly give distant commanders a power base of their own. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The relevant distinction is the difference between ordinary oversight of officials and a deliberate frontier bargain that accepts some loss of control in exchange for operational speed. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and when that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is delegation and autonomy trade-off theory in frontier leadership, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. Delegation-autonomy trade-off theory, how frontier command bargains exchange tighter oversight for faster local defense, and how rulers try to limit the risks that bargain creates. The distinction matters here. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is deliberately simple to state and much harder to build in practice. Frontier stability may depend less on the personal loyalty of one commander than on a deliberately structured bargain that trades. The first point is geographical. A frontier problem often matures before central consultation can travel there and back again. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. That is why ordinary chain-of-command logic starts breaking down at distance, especially where raids, local alliances, or shifting conditions require immediate judgment. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A ruler can answer this by granting more autonomy to a distant commander, allowing decisions to be made near the problem instead of near the throne. That is the mechanism. Yet autonomy is never free because the same discretion that speeds defense also strengthens local prestige, local loyalty, and local habit of acting without permission. That is the mechanism. The frontier bargain therefore exchanges one kind of risk for another, slower response risk for political concentration risk. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A strong design tries to make autonomy functional, not sovereign, giving the commander room to act while limiting the resources needed for full separation. That is the mechanism. Rotation, divided fiscal authority, parallel reporting, and periodic inspection can all narrow the bargain without destroying its speed entirely. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. The center may also preserve dependence by making supply, recognition, or promotion flow through institutions the commander cannot fully own personally. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. This is why frontier autonomy should not be mistaken for simple trust. It is a negotiated and monitored necessity. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. The commander is valuable precisely because local conditions cannot wait for perfect central knowledge, which means some ambiguity is built into the role from the beginning. That is the mechanism. That ambiguity becomes dangerous when local success starts creating a political identity stronger than administrative subordination. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. It becomes sustainable when the commander's usefulness keeps pointing back toward the center's resources, legitimacy, or power. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. The frontier thus reveals a deep truth about leadership. Sometimes control is preserved not by refusing autonomy, but by calibrating autonomy carefully enough that it remains dependent. That is the mechanism. That calibration is hard, because each extra freedom that improves defense can also strengthen the commander's independent bargaining position later on. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. So the strategic question is never whether autonomy is safe. It is whether the state can design a bargain whose benefits arrive faster than its dangers mature. That is the mechanism. A fair counterpoint is that some frontier commanders remain loyal largely because circumstances favor loyalty, not because institutional calibration was especially refined. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. The limitation is that frontier settings differ widely, so terrain, transport, neighboring powers, and communication speed all change how autonomy should be judged. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. The bargain fails when local military success, local patronage, and administrative distance combine into a semi-independent command that no longer needs the center very much. The limits still matter. There is also a rational exception in highly stable border zones, where reduced threat can justify re-centralizing authority without catastrophic loss of responsiveness. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate because a well-designed frontier command can still serve coercive or unjust political ends. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Even so, the pattern remains useful. Where rulers explicitly trade limited control for speed while preserving dependence through other channels, frontiers often hold more effectively than through rigid centralization alone. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Rulers granted distant commanders more independence because frontier defense often required speed the center could not provide, and the long-term strategy was to manage that autonomy, not deny the frontier the discretion it needed. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. The explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking which decisions truly require local speed and which ones the center can still keep for itself. Ask the structural question. Authority moves through institutions, and frontiers expose that movement by forcing the state to choose where discretion must live. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the deeper question becomes how dependence is preserved after autonomy has already been granted. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. This outcome cannot be reduced to loyalty alone, because loyalty itself is shaped by resources, reporting, recognition, and political design. Ask the structural question. Strategic effectiveness is not legitimacy, yet the lesson remains that distant speed often has to be purchased with carefully limited freedom. Ask the structural question. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether a state can keep a frontier fast enough to survive without making that frontier autonomous enough to drift into a rival power center. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.